this time we could not make up our minds who's going to do the intro for the next speaker. So we decided to do it together.
Yes. So how do you even introduce someone you've known since the 90s? Maybe earlier for you.
Yeah, so maybe you don't know that there is this statistics that Estonians are quite proud of, that it's one of the least corrupt countries in the world. So in order to balance the scales a little bit, then we went to high school together with the next speaker. So there's a bit of corruption and conflict of interest involved. It's just, to be honest, we just made my life easier.
Full disclosure.
Yeah.
Me and Liisa, who is already waiting to come up on stage, we've known each other since there were chat rooms in Telnet. Hands up if you're old enough to remember that. Thank you.
There are two people as old as you are.
Yes.
I had to point it out. Anyways, Liisa has actually done many interesting things, and the funny part is that I haven't seen her since the high school. So turns out that in the meanwhile she was the CISO for Estonia.
So
and,
responsible for the cybersecurity of the whole country. Can you imagine?
So she will come and talk to us how to manage that. Welcome on stage.
Thank you. Thank you. And despite me having very heavily advocated for a deep tech cybersecurity and why non-functional testing is so far superior to functional testing that we don't even want to get started on it, lecture for 90 minutes. I was dissuaded from it, and therefore we'll talk about how to be accurate, but not sound like a robot, a smartass, or an alien. In other words, how to speak human, which for engineers to do really nicely is not really that easy after all. And it comes from the fact that we all suffer from biases that have already been discussed today. One of them being the bias of thinking that everyone is the same as you are. And this might or might not be a dialogue that I might or might not have had, where I had a Jira ticket and he thought it was a band. So, with this time for a disco dance, a lot of communication is about understanding that, first of all, you have your own knowledge bias, that you think that others know what you know, and you quite often take it for granted that what you know is not that special. And on the other hand, top management has simplicity bias in an incredibly complex world where they just need to make more decisions than is humanly possible for a brain that's been designed to eat berries and run away from bears. And a lot of users and non-techies, and I let you on my dirty little secret, I'm a non-techie really, have what we call technology bias, which is thinking that technology should work because it's this auto-magical black box that makes things happen. So that's sort of where, when we're communicating technology, where we start off with before we even talk about technology. There's competing interests and biases where people expect technology to just work. And as far as I understand, you all work in trying to find out ways in which technology doesn't work. So there's a bit of communication issue in there, possibly. So what I'll talk about today is how to get your message across, and specifically message on technology. A few tricks that might be helpful, and sort of planning techniques that might help you, and how to do that around technology without completely panicking. Now, if you're not nervous before going on stage, Okay, actually, hands up if you're nervous before going on stage, and that includes the speakers. Okay, we've identified the psychopaths in this audience, by the way. If you're not nervous, even as a top performer in entertainment, if you're not nervous, you're not trying hard enough, or you really maybe should talk to a psychiatrist. Being nervous and trying to prepare is perfectly natural and normal, regardless of how many times you've done this. And what I've discovered, having been in human rights as well as technology and everything in between, is that I really like to solve interesting puzzles with people I respect. I mean, a less charitable person might say that I get easily bored. But what I've also found that every single job I've had, from advocating for legislation in Estonia, to global education, to working with the NATO Corporate Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in my position as common sense, in other words, the only woman in management. Well, the only civilian woman in management, to be exact, is that whatever I do, I need to convince people, I need to rally support, I need to advocate for certain actions, so I need to understand something, and then I need to convey that message to the audience for whom I'm understanding it. And that goes from really my activism to some of the war stories when the Estonian ID card almost broke because the math in the key generation wasn't mathing, and the private key generation ran out of randomness, which is an issue if you're doing cryptography. So regardless of what it is, you need to communicate either a solution, a fact, a finding, a recommendation, or an action. Because people hardly ever support or gather behind what they don't know about and what they don't understand. So, no, that's me, but let's talk about who are you? Who are these people, in IT that make the automagical black box work? Of course, I first asked Google. And it turns out that we live inside of the matrix in information technology. So I figured I'll get more specific. Software engineering gets at least a few infographics. Things get slightly better with QA engineering, who get informative infographics. So, and this is really what a manager or a partner, both in life and in business or in work, might think of you. You're this automagical thing inside of the matrix. I figured let's ask ChatGPT to draw, because this isn't very useful. So this is what the software tester looks like, according to the ultimate wisdom of ChatGPT. I thought, given that QA engineering is somehow more reputable, here, spot 10 differences between a software tester and QA engineer. The engineers wear darker denim, apparently, and are slightly less cross-eyed. So I figured, let's try for, instead of what they look like, let's try for what they do, which apparently your teams point at each other in offices, which I think is enough to say that what all of us do to normal people looks like either the hacker dog or hacker cat, and leaves them wondering what the hell. And this is where what your planning assumption in when you're thinking of how you communicate should be, that the audience has other interests, other knowledge than you, and most likely thinks, what the hell? And up until probably 10 years ago, I've been in technology slightly longer than that, this being complicated in their communication and not being human readable or human understandable was what engineers did to get peace to work. Because if you said, oh, it's technical, you wouldn't understand, most managers and most clients left you alone. I remember asking one of the most brilliant cyber forensics engineers and researchers I've ever met to explain something to me, a concept in his field. He said, "Oh, it's technical." I said, "I know, that's why I'm coming to you." He said, "But you wouldn't understand." I said, "Try me." He said, no, but really it is technical and you're a girl." I said, "Again, try me." So we went back and forth about half a dozen times, at which point this gentleman turned around, ran into the men's room and locked himself in. And I think that illustrates how far this industry has come. It was perfectly okay in IT to be doing mumbo-jumbo. It was perfectly okay to say that IPv6 is like IPv4 but more advanced. And no one would ask you, "What? Human, please?" But since now technology is so horizontally mainstreamed, in other words, everything we do, everything in a society is based on a technology process or reliant on an information system one way or another, the industry can no longer be trying to hide in the men's room or maybe in the smoker's corner. So let's start off with what communication is. And I promise this is probably the last ChatGPT drawing. It's a superpower, and it's a superpower because it allows you to get others behind you. And whether that is in resourcing, whether it's in support, whether it's in decisions, or whether it's in taking action, communication is the only way to legally get that support as a professional. Also in personal life, but you do you. And what we usually say about communication, that it's about a communicator, so someone who has something to convey. What they have to convey is a message, right? And it's to the recipient. Looks sort of okay. Well, that's like saying that UDP works for everything. Have a great UDP joke, by the way, but I can't make sure that you'd get it. No Estonians laughed, by the way. So this broadcast model of sender, receiver, and message is so 20th century. It's basically this model of just talking at people. And as you can tell, and probably remember from elementary school, being talked at is not the best way to get you to pay attention. So instead, what communication is about is transmitting and conveying a message and a meaning. So it's not just that you broadcast something out, but it's that you're responsible for the audience to receive it. Whether by looking at feedback, I really appreciate the first row pretty aggressively nodding their heads. This is the feedback I'm needing on the stage right now. Whether it's by seeing whether the actions taken match the instructions you were giving. Whether it's by looking at longer-term feedback, whether it's by asking clarifying questions, including the raise your hand if you don't understand, including the should I go into this deeper? And by using communication techniques such as repeating without repetition, storytelling rather than just going right at it, that help you get across to the audience. So really, I guess good communication is like TCP rather than UDP, where, and let's face it, for critical communication, would you ever do UDP? Okay, I promise that's the end of that analogy. I've milked it to death. Usually I'm in front of audiences where I have to explain it the other way around. So it's passing an understanding of information, and communication only takes place when the other side can understand you and can get your message and can hear you or see you or whatever it is. So That also means that as the communicator, you're in an incredibly powerful position where you get to frame how the communication goes. In this picture, the communicator, the person whispering into the tin can, is the one who can see whether the cable is held straight and is held tightly enough so that the other side can hear them in this game of telephone. So it actually, communication, whether it's one-on-one in a meeting, and I've done team meetings, and I've done one-on-ones where we're in the same room, but we're typing on Skype. And that wasn't because of my request. But as the communicator, you get to pick how things are framed, what language is used, what examples are used, what illustrations are used. And that actually is an incredibly powerful position. So as someone with a message, you're in the position of power, not the audience. And you should remember that, because that way you're maybe not as nervous. And any planning for communication has to start with who is your audience and what do they need from you. Because that helps you think what you tell them, because we all know more than we can ever share. So it's the obvious. Adjust to the roles and needs. Now, a manager needs input for decision making. The higher up they are, the more complexity they've already juggled today, the simpler they want it to be. Which is why the likes of me are in between engineers and decision makers, because an engineer's not great at giving yes or no answers, and as a manager, you're buffering the risk of simplifying things. That's your job as a manager, to then go up to decision makers. So what's the role and what are the needs? A cross-functional team will want to be on the same page. I think the word alignment is the biggest corporate bullshit there is, but so are cross-functional teams. So in a cross-functional team, you want to make sure that you're all going in the same direction, because with this difference of backgrounds and people having somewhat competing interests, otherwise one wants to go this way, the other one wants to go that way, the third feels sorry that you're not going this way because they have real FOMO about going into that far corner, and the team ends up doing just this. And that's not great. So what their background is, so what sort of language examples they're used to. Now, I struggle talking to fundamental rights lawyers because a lawyer is trained to judge things in black and white. So they want 100% security guarantees. I can add 9s with resources to the 90% or 99% availability. But the only way I can do 100% privacy, for example, is by taking the system, taking a hammer to it, and then burying it under the sea. And then, I can do 100% integrity and confidentiality at the cost of 0% availability, which I've been told is not optimal for information systems. So what it is that their background is and how they're used to communicating and receiving information. Language and terminology. Please do not throw up jargon on people. It's really unpleasant. Even the people who have to be resourcing the upgrade to IPv6, which in Estonia's case was a little late, do you really not need to understand the technicalities of why we'll run out of internet with IPv4, so we have to resource the upgrade? But they do sort of have to understand that this is urgent. And the channel. Communicate to people in the way they're used to. So if they're used to seeing things on TV, particularly generationally, there's a generation who really trusts TV, which is not generation YouTube, by the way, mutually exclusive. For public information campaigns, I've done short news-like TV spots because That's the format that people are used to. For politicians, you have to write a memo that's both detailed and brief and has all the information and is human readable and again is less than 1 page. And that is the format they're used to, and they will not read page 2. So, you do this simplified text for people with special needs and politicians. And that is what you do. Because your job is to be understood. It's not that the only choice the other side of communication has, the recipient, is whether they try to understand you or not. And you have to make it as easy as possible for them. And I find this really useful. If I have a new piece of information or if I have something to communicate, I will state the fact. I will then say what it means in the context we're talking about, why it matters, and therefore what needs to be done or what the change we want to see is. So, and this is particularly useful actually with marketing people, because the decision makers and the C-suite, worries about business critical systems being up and running, but marketing really wants things to be pretty. And the only way to shut them down from another prettification is to explain that that would come at the cost of business criticality. Hypothetically speaking, of course. But regardless of where we are, this is really useful. This is this, it means that, it matters because, or it's important because, and therefore. And to this day when I'm writing, I write my first draft follows that structure, and then eventually I'll maybe rephrase it to be slightly more elegant. And that includes explaining what testing is, and explaining, especially when you're presenting your results or your findings or your recommendations, make sure you explain the methodology and scope of what you were doing. And now not in technical terminology, but, what did we do and why? Because otherwise, I've been in a room where there's very clever and very technical people, the best Estonia has in terms of digital identity. And yet when the ID card ran out of randomness, not optimal, one of them waltzes in and says, "Oh, but it's all secure because it's certified." And no one asked to what the certification criteria was and what that would mean. A couple days later, I go back and go, "So the certification, what does it mean? Can you talk me through it?" It turns out it was functionality certification. In other words, they had certified a cow to give milk. But when security problems came up, they assumed that the certification for the cow to give milk also provided security guarantees, and more importantly, also would reverse the cow to make hay from milk because it makes milk from hay. So explaining what you do as testers and what the scope and what the limitations are is fundamental, because otherwise you're getting a false sense of security, and that will come and bite you in the ass. And this is the second thing I found incredibly useful, how do you think of your target audience? It's from marketing, it's basically, you always want them to take action, right? You want to take action, whether it's improve the system, whether it's buy the new product, whatever it is, it's action. Not beat up foreigners on the street kind of thing also. Estonia used to be racist, is less so now. So first, you're going to have to assume that your target audience is unaware of what you're talking about, which means you need to move them into awareness. You need to give them the basic facts. And at this stage, it usually would need to be simple metaphors, stories, relating it back to what they know. Very, very basic, very, very simple. No TCP, UDP jokes here, basically. It's communication protocol tells us how bits move magically through the pipes of internet. Because why would a person ever have thought about a communication protocol? So awareness is when they understand that the thing exists. The pipes of internet actually have some rules. We call that routing and protocols. Comprehension is where they understand what that means. So again, in this example, understanding that UDP is great for video, but for anything critical, you want to be doing TCP. We pick the protocol according to what our needs are in this particular initiative project system. But comprehension, of course, is not enough. It's the next step is critical, which is conviction. Being convinced that your solution is the best. Whether it's picking, the best testing methodology, whether it's picking which findings to fix first, whether it's anything else, or whether it's choosing whether you're going to stay for the PowerPoint karaoke tonight. You need to know that the PowerPoint karaoke exists before you can stay for it. And it's enough for me to know that Christian really likes it. Because after all, he was a pretty decent guy at 15 already, as was Kaspar, by the way. And this is where a lot of people stop their communication. They stop with saying, well, you're convinced. You know that my solution, my proposal, my recommendation is by far the superior. But that ain't gonna do shit for you. Pardon my French. You need people to take action, which means that you need to tell them, based on your recommendation, what the best step forward is. And let's not even take examples from technology. Let's take it from sorting trash instead, recyclables. None of us want turtles and baby dolphins to die because of plastic waste in the oceans. But unless someone tells me how to break my yogurt into 4 different pieces of recyclables, I'm going to be guilty of that somehow. So making sure that you give people instructions of what to do. And it's pretty binary. You can't assume that people will think of your behalf or people will think the way you want them to think. So make sure that you give instructions. Because otherwise, the target audience lives in their own volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world. And the higher up they are as decision makers, the more volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity they are seeing on a daily, hourly, and probably minute-by-minute basis. So what the target audience is doing is not worrying about you, but they're catastrophizing things. They're ignoring things if they can be ignored. They're panicking. They're quite often going into a free fall. And this is when it's your job as the communicator to turn on the light bulbs that matter for you. I found 3 things that are so fundamental to it that I actually got them tattooed on me. Spoiler alert, I'm not going to need to undress here, though. First of them, kairos. The Greek philosopher's idea of not the chronological time, chronos, but instead the right and opportune moment to do something. The right time for communication in our case. So for me, it means only raise hell if that's going to make a difference, because raising hell has a huge cognitive and emotional overhead. And what it means usually in translating technical information to decision makers' information or clients' information is asking yourself, what do they need to know versus what do they need to know now? It's sort of like the difference between a fire alarm, which is you need to know now that you need to evacuate, versus the basic evacuation instructions. You need to know them, but we don't need to lecture you on that now. So the need to know versus the need to know now. And the now becomes particularly important when things hit the fan, metaphorically speaking. And when things hit the fan, there's a few things. First of all, your communication needs to become more immediate. You can't rely on routine channels. Your communication needs to become more personal. So we have a problem that's going to shut down this whole company. Merits, if you're certain of it, merits storming the office of the decision makers. Are the systems up and running as it should be? Does not merit that. And then in that moment, of course, what are the critical pieces of information? Because in the fog of an incident, you don't know much anything. When we had the ID card issue again, the first time we briefed the Prime Minister said, so wait. And it was an encryption issue in the firm where the RSA crypto library had been implemented lazily by a person who didn't understand cryptography much more than I do, which is not optimal, because I think cryptographers are like seals, really cute, but evolutionarily ridiculous. So we had this potential. I really appreciate the first row, by the way. We had this potential mathematical vulnerability that eventually would come and take down 600,000 ID cards unless we did something about it. We had found out about it by responsible disclosure of an academic. Our vendors and their vendors and their vendors told us everything was okay and there's nothing to see here, because they were dealing with credit card companies that had tens of millions of these faulty cards. We had 600,000 citizens and their digital identities. Whom you're going to choose? So the Prime Minister looked at us and said, so the academics found my PIN codes. A couple days later, he was already explaining to the Minister of Economic Affairs and IT in her terminology what exactly had happened, which is that there was bad engineering and we were not responsible, but we've got to fix it because otherwise digital identity will need to be shut down. But for that, we had a team of 20, 30 people working around the clock for a week to be able to compose that sentence. So when things hit the fan, you become more immediate, you become more personal, and you're allowed to say, I don't know, but we'll find out. So you're allowed to talk about processes if you don't know the facts. Secondly, ethikos. Well, I have etika because feminine of it. Ethikos is often translated as ethics, but it's really the morality as in your character. So who you are as a person. And to me, that means that don't fight who you are. No, as someone who is incredibly technically exact in IT often, do not fight that. Do not try to speak in corporate bullshit. Because this realignment of strategic goals as it pertains to Q4 in finding creative synergies, that sentence means nothing. And people go to business schools for several years to find out that that sentence means nothing, but by then they're so far in debt that they have to be able to pay it back by making money. And I apologize for those of you in corporate careers. So do not fight who you are, but rather work on your strengths. And your strengths are your values. Your strengths are the very particular little fine thing that you obsessed over and found everything out about that no one else knows. And it can be your style. It can be that you're not full of corporate jargon of synergies and strategic alignment. Having said that, please put a shirt on. Please follow the rules of the format. When I was hiring like a madwoman, at the point where people applied to be a sysadmin because they had worked at the front desk as an administrator of a hotel. We interviewed anyone who was promising. In one case, and this is over Zoom, the camera is off. It's me, the future boss, the head of HR, and this engineer who comes with good recommendations and good credentials, and his camera is off. So we say, oh, could you possibly put your camera on so that we can see you? And he says, give me a minute. By the time he comes back, I asked him if he went to put his shirt on, and he said yes. Follow the format's rules. Speak and present yourself the way the format assumes, because that way you don't have to fight against the format. And none of us is that brilliant that we can afford to be assholes and show up naked. So be yourself, but please, 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 I beg you to put a shirt on. And finally, logos, the third line, which is, again, translated as logic, but it's really rationality. It also, in biblical Greek, it's the word. So the world starts with a word, but it's also rationality in what separates man and beast, and that's from Aristotle. And that's your ability to explain why. This is a classic experiment. First of all, you all know what that machine is. Okay. It's a photocopier. And of course, if you're a psychology professor, you're doing what's easiest for you and what's available for free, which is experiment on undergraduate students, using graduate students as the experimenters. In this classic social psychology experiment, Ellen Langer from Harvard had people try to cut the line at the library. Also, remember what the library is? In the first case, they said, excuse me, I have 5 pages, may I use the Xerox machine? What proportion of people let them jump the line? What do you think? 80? Any other? 0? 5? I mean, the answer is between 5 and 80. 60%. So about 2/3 allowed just with this simple explanation to jump the line. Second one, excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine because I'm in a rush? So giving a reason, an argument. What do you think the response rate was? 80%? 55 lower? It was actually 94. So 94% let people jump the line if they gave a reason. And then what happened is this, what I would call a placebo or a nonsense argument, something that looks like an argument, but has no content. Excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine because I need to make copies? At first, it was interpreted to say that, the structure is more important than the content. In other words, as long as because your audience is triggered to cooperate, to take your instructions and let you run with it. Kristen, can I have your car? Forever. Because I want a car. What I think it actually is then in situations where it's more expensive to think about what people are saying than just cooperate. People cooperate regardless of the content of what you're saying. But when it's expensive emotionally, financially, in terms of any other resource, they differentiate between these two conditions. So when you're asking someone to support you or give you resources, make sure that your argument is genuine. By the way, did I tell you I forgot the third one. How many of you think that, what do you think the response rate was for the third condition? 45. It was 94 for the first one, 90. 93. So insignificantly lower than for the genuine reason. But your testers, you're used to thinking critically, you want resources from managers who are resource scarce, so do not use the placebo argument. But what it in the end is, and what in the end communication is storytelling that relates what you want to convey to the known of the audience and tells them why it matters. And yeah, that's why I took needles to myself. And remember that good enough is good enough. I mean, you're an audience who's subjected your back seats to foldable chairs for a day. It would be ideal to have something slightly more comfortable, but good enough is good enough. And the first time I spoke in front of an audience, my hands were shaking. So I thought I'd go and hold on to the lectern. So I gave a speech in the press hall of the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, holding on to a lectern that was completely shaking for the whole 7 minutes of the duration of my speech. So remember, good enough is good enough, and what matters, just like runway models, if and when you fall, and you will fall, the only way to not fall is to not do anything or not go anywhere, is you get up and you carry on going. Because people will generally remember the clever things you said, but they won't remember who fell down. And as a complete closing personal anecdote, my biggest brain freeze as a public speaker happened right here on this stage at one of the Tallinn Digital Summits, when one of my panelists was called Jorge, but went by George. So I asked him before my introducing him what he prefers. I know, even with my broken English with a heavy Estonian accent, I can say Jorge, but I can also say George. He said he doesn't really mind. So I go up on stage and I say, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome Horse to the stage. I look at him, he's laughing, my brain freezes and I say horse again. So I look at him again, my brain is still frozen, and I say, Horse, the stage is all yours.
Right. Any questions? I saw your hand first.
Hello, thank you for the wonderful presentation. At my company, I am often holding knowledge transfer sessions and introducing the product that we are working on different QAs from different departments. I am always holding a little bit of pause and asking every 5 minutes any questions, and nobody asks any questions. But later on, maybe a couple hours later or a day later, they ask questions. So my question is, during these presentations, how can I persuade them to ask a question, because the situation is they don't know what they don't know. Yeah. So how can I help them realize what they don't know in order to ask questions?
So, the question was, how do you get people to ask questions when they don't know what they don't know? Being the first to ask a question is really daunting, so thank you for doing that. And my only real professional skill that I found unique is that I'm not particularly afraid to make a complete ass of myself. So if I don't understand something, I will ask questions until I understand. I was last years old when I realized that that's not how most people work. So to invite questions, first of all, there's actually studies that show that this language, I'm ready now to answer any of your questions, feels less daunting for people than, do you have any questions? It's somehow slightly psychologically safer. Secondly, use sort of mixed teaching methodologies. So again, to create a space of seeing things in practice, to maybe try to place the information that you're conveying into their existing knowledge. maybe seeing the product in action. Because understanding from the abstract that you don't know what you don't know is really hard. Understanding from seeing the product in practice, it's much easier. And thirdly, create other ways of asking questions than this. You have to be the first one to raise your hand and say, the hell is this? So instead, small group discussions, technology tools, whiteboarding, and all sorts of practical, interactive things generally help people to overcome the question shyness. Bullying doesn't work.
We're ready for the next question. But the microphone is stubbornly silent.
Well, things work still better when they're switched on. Go ahead.
Yeah, good evening. Good evening. Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask a small question. Did the guy without the shirt got his gig or not?
He did, actually. But we made a deal that he's also not just wearing a shirt, but also pants to the office. He preferred to work from home most days. And we also, at least for team meetings and client meetings, we had everyone have cameras on.
So I'm quite happy I remembered to put the shirt on this morning. Do we have more?
I read once that for a Nordic audience, you should give like 10 seconds to think about it before they will have questions, but this is Nordic, so it's Nordic testing days.
A question myself, then we get there. So in communication, in your opinion, what is the hardest obstacle to overcome when you're, let's say, dealing with very, let's say, prejudiced people?
Oh, like you mean when you're a loud girl in technology?
For instance.
I think the hardest prejudice to deal with is when you've been pre-dismissed. In other words, when it's assumed that what you're saying doesn't make sense. Whether it's because you're too technical, whether it's because you don't understand the complexities, whether it's because there's 99 other problems and the audience doesn't want to add one more. So it's when you've been prejudged in that manner. And I mean, so I got the CISP certificate, which is the hardest exam I've ever taken, so that I don't have to explain that I sort of at least understand the basics of technology. And I put, for that sort of audiences, whilst hating formality and whilst hating this, I'm the most adult person in the room, I know how to adult. I hate that stuff. But I also know that it saves me a good 15 minutes, and it saves me being not a very pleasant conversation partner if I do 1 minute of, here's why I sort of know what I'm talking about. So, I mean, I got a certificate that was really hard to study for, to be able to put that on my LinkedIn. And I go in and I say, here's why I have reasons to be saying what I'm saying. And that goes from, if you're an entry-level tester, and you've prudently gone through the product, to put it out there and say, this is how we went through it, and here are the findings, and these are the critical ones. Do you write to when you're the king of the universe? Put your credibility out there, and especially if you're a nervous presenter or a nervous communicator, have your resume and have your experience speak for you. So put it front and center. To not have to be an asshole for 15 minutes of, And again, I apologize for the metaphor, but no, I've been in enough rooms where I've needed to explain that I can pee standing up, and also why that doesn't matter. So put your credentials or your reasons to be taken seriously and your reasons to be believed, put that up front if you think the audience would dismiss you otherwise.
Thank you. We got one more.
Thank you. I laughed so much. I'm wondering, from your experience, can you share some situation where you actually managed to convince somebody from the C-level to give you money for something? What worked? What didn't work? And is it any different when you're talking with politicians?
So the more political the person is, the more afraid they are of failure. So the more risk-averse they are and the more political they are. And that's true for civil service as well as politicians. And that's also actually true for founders in fast-growing companies. At the point where the founder, willpower and hacking and Red Bull maybe isn't the best way to run the thing anymore. They feel incredibly insecure because they understand that there's either a vote or there's new board members that might get rid of you because we're now at a different stage of growth. So for them, you have to provide a face-saving measure. I once did an April Fool's joke that I thought was obvious, but that resulted in an international military organization sending a diplomatic note to the Swedish Foreign Ministry and to the Royal Palace. I thought my joke was really obviously funny. When my director did not realize it was a joke and had our jokey letter sent back to the Swedish Foreign Ministry, I realized that being a gentleman about it and just going in and saying, no, we're sorry, is not good enough. We have to give him at least 2 options, and both of the options have to not suck for all of us, of saving his face. So for these risk-averse people, so what we did was we went in. I decided, because I had a very good working relationship with him, I just decided, I'm going to take, and if needed, I'm going to take the bullet for the team because the bad joke was done by the secretaries, but it wasn't their idea. The idea was all me and one of my colleagues. So we went in and we said, listen, we're really sorry. This seems to have gotten out of hand. And we're really sorry. And first of all, would you like us? And his face drops because this is a military officer for whom credibility and being taken serious is everything. His face drops. I go, because I'm me and I have very little filter, I go, would you like me to run out and get brandy? He says no. And he just stares into his eyes are not focusing. He's staring into the void in front, in between us. So I say, we're really, really sorry again. But I have 2 options for you, both of which would be okay. One, you yell at all of us, and we admit that your team has a really bad sense of humor, and we deserve it. But secondly, you get out to everyone you sent our bad joke to, and because they've not gone, ha-ha, April 1st, you say, ha-ha, April 1st. He still stares into emptiness, so we all sort of backwards moonwalk out of his office. And we don't dare to pass because it's a glass wall, so we don't dare to pass it for about 10 minutes. In 15 minutes, he sends like a reply to all email going, ha, gotcha. So the more risk-averse people are, the more you have to give them options to save their face, and the more you have to understand that that you're saving the face. The more risk-averse they are and more corporate they are, the more they want to have a simple and quick solution. So I think that's sort of my golden rule.
Can I steal one more?
I don't have a clock up here, so I don't know if it's been 2 minutes or 2 hours.
You mentioned alignment a lot. Can you elaborate for all of us? Why do you think it's bullshit?
So I think it's bullshit because it's an umbrella over so many things. So I absolutely think a team needs to be going in one sort of direction. And I think it's the managers or the directors or the leaders' responsibility to make sure that not everyone's sort of twisting around like a mad dervish, but instead that we're providing this sort of leadership to inspire a direction. And a lot of it is rhetorical. But if the leader is not doing that, a leader without followers is just a dumbass taking a walk. And I think the dumbasses taking walks alone are the ones who then start talking about alignment as a responsibility of the team. Like if you're an expert or a specialist on a cross-functional or mission-driven team, and if your manager or your leader comes to you and talks about you needing to get aligned, that's basically them having failed to provide direction. And I think it's corporate speak for bad leadership.
Thank you.
Aitäh.